Joe, what's happening? Man, if I was any better, I'd be twins. I am doing well. How about yourself? Oh, you are the man for being on video. I did not know if you would be able to put, you'd be surprised how many pastors we've done this with where I asked them to Skype and they were like, what's Skype? It's like, okay. I'll tell you what, we'll just write letters back and forth. And yeah, you doing all right? Oh yeah, me too. You too. And so I don't even know if you know kind of where we're at in the whole um, evolution. Maybe not the right word, but in the evolution of 2040 Double. I partnered up with Jerry and Lance a few years ago, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I was doing church construction at the time, and I'd left, and I was still doing consulting around that. And I had a small list of pastors that I was working with to do church construction stuff. And they were like, hey, a buddy of mine introduced me to him, Casey Graham. Do you know Casey? Yeah, because at quick glance, you guys could be separated at birth. When I first saw you, I was like, oh, it's Casey. But so Casey introduced us, and we kind of, got the thing going. And now I just looked at it this morning. We've got like 386 pastors or churches active in the online portion, which is amazing. And they're in 9 countries, which is just nuts. Yeah, and it's the really neat thing is there's so much that you learn, and it's like it looks like brilliance in the rearview mirror, and then you realize, hey, we that wasn't intentional. But just the idea that when Jerry was doing this, they were paying 3, 4, 5 grand a month to have Dr. Weston come in, and then they started doing the live thing, and it started. That was about $500 a month for churches between the costs and everything, and now it's $99 a month, and they've. But the best part of it is they're experiencing the training with the people in their church. They're not having to come back and necessarily teach it. So it's pretty cool. Hey, here's what we're going to do is I'll just, this thing is going to be, it'll flow in the fact that, up front, I'm going to tell you, it doesn't need to be like an infomercial for 2040 Double. I mean, there will obviously be parts of that are natural to the conversation, but don't feel like you got to hit it too hard. I mean, most of the pastors that we're trying to reach with this, we really are just trying to encourage them, and let them know, that the emotions they're experiencing are universal, even though it feels like they're the only one out there that can't really figure out how to make something work or get their church unstuck. So I'll just do a quick introduction, and I'll start asking you questions, and we'll just let the spirit take us wherever we go. Okay. Okay. All right. So just jump in. Well, so I'll know where to stop. Well, hey, this is Richard with 24 Double, and I am really excited today to have as my guest on the podcast Joe Dobbins from Twin Rivers Worship Center up in St. Louis. Joe, how you doing? Yeah, and man, I really enjoy taking the time out of our schedule to kind of dive in, not just with pastors that are in 24 to double, but just with pastors in general, because I think everybody has a story to tell, and there's bits and pieces of that story that are going to resonate with the people that are watching this on YouTube or listening to it on the podcast. So I just wanted to say thanks for that. And with that, hey, let's dive right in. Give me your background. I know Jerry Lawson, who is my partner in 24 to Double, introduced us, but tell me, how do you know Jerry, and kind of how'd you get involved in this world? Yeah. So one of the big lessons I just learned from you there is be careful if you're consulting with churches. because you could wind up being the lead pastor of that church. So you said something clicked. Can you take us back and kind of do you remember what it was specifically, like the idea or the thought that clicked? Yeah, and that is a it's an incredibly powerful concept. Jerry teaches us a lot, and I'll just hit it real quick because some of the people listening may not know what the 1 to 4 ratio is. But basically, for every person you add in a volunteer spot in your church will grow by 4. And that may sound like hocus pocus or mysticism to some of you, but if you think about the 80-20 principle, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work, well, for every person you add to the 20%, your church is going to naturally expand. So it's not just Jerry's principle or 24 to double. It's actually the Pareto principle that the more people that you add in volunteer roles, the more your church will grow. It's an inverse relationship. We don't necessarily think of growing our churches from the inside out that way, but it absolutely works. Yeah. Now talk a little bit about that, about hosting people, because this is what's fascinating to me is how many pastors have been through 24 to double and they'll tell me something that we taught them that we didn't actually teach them. Which we do teach that kind of concept, but the when it begins to grow in your church and you make it your own, it looks completely different. So what does it mean to host people at Twin Rivers? Hmm. That's incredible, and it dives into a principle that I absolutely believe is true, and it's the idea that people gravitate towards environments where they're accepted and away from environments where they feel rejected. And I often try to tell pastors, just remember the last time you went to somewhere for the first time that you didn't know anybody, and what how awkward that was, and what that felt like, and you've got to mitigate that. Hey, talk. Go ahead. Right. And talk dive a little bit. You mentioned the pastor's breakfast earlier, and for those that don't know, talk about what you do with the pastor's breakfast and how you're leveraging that environment. Yeah, that's huge. And give examples of so when they come into that environment, next steps. There's always something for them to do next, something to move forward into ministry, into deeper relationships. Talk about what are some of their options and which ones do most people tend to gravitate towards. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you keep numbers on what percentage of those people are around 1 year, 3 years, 5 years of those 87%? So you've got 90% of the people that you've got. Well, it's not necessarily 90%. If you've got 1,600 in average weekly attendance, you got 1,400 people in life groups. Yeah, right. And more average weekly attendance is not the best number for active involvement because the average person's only coming 2.4 times per month. Yeah, and I'm at North Point here in Atlanta, and Andy Stanley always says that life change happens in circles, not in rows. And what he means is in groups. And you guys are killing it for getting people into groups. And that really is what people want from church. They want community. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit on you. Talk just a little bit about. I'm trying to think if I want to go forward or backwards here. So let's go forward for a second. When you look out over the next year to 3 years to 5 years, what do you see as the biggest challenge that's coming for Twin Rivers and for you as a leader in this church? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's going to be a bigger issue for churches as more and more people move to metropolitan areas. That we're all struggling with that. Which I'm on the north side of Atlanta, and it is really it's hard for churches to get going here because they start in a school, they build some momentum, and then they have a hard time transitioning to property because the giving's just not where it needs to be to make that happen. Yeah, so let me dive into that just a little bit because I know that there's a lot of pastors that are listening to this that they're in a church where the last guy had a lot of influence and for one reason or another most of the time that guy just he's retired or whatever it is and they've done it this way for 20 years and that's the way they do it and the new guy has a hard time gaining influence. I mean, how do you approach that issue of not being the go-to guy as you're taking on, transition and moving into that role over time? Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is, I think that is one of the most difficult things to do as a leader, is to constantly remind yourself, especially in the world that we live in, that God's working through you, and it's not necessarily you doing the work. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to be around a lot of church famous people, having worked with. You may not know this, but the people listening probably will. That I worked with John Maxwell for years, and I think I've met just about every celebrity pastor that there is, and it is just amazing how hard it is not to buy into the hype, or when people are coming up and saying great sermon, you're doing this great, or you have a little bit of success, like figuring out how to fight that off so that you can stay humble and still continue to grow. Hmm. Yeah, and I think it says a lot about the previous pastor's leadership, that the fact that the church did not just fall apart after he left, because I think there's a lot of churches still, there are a lot of churches that have a tough time making that transition because it's so focused around that personality. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Hey, go back now and let's talk about you. So you got involved with Jerry. What now? Were you on staff at a different church when you were going through that? And if you had to, man, this is going to be a big question to sum up in just a paragraph or two. But like, if you take a step back from those 150 pastors that you worked with, what would you say the biggest challenge that they faced in turning the ship? Because there's a lot of guys out there that are. It's just as hard to get a flat church to gain momentum as it is the one that's declining. Maybe even harder because of some of the elements. But because sometimes people think good is good enough. When you're in severe decline like that, everybody knows that something needs to happen. But when you're replacing the dead every year, and that's how you're staying flat. I mean, people think, well, this is our church and it's for us and not for anybody else. I mean, how do you when you look out there at those churches, what do you see as the biggest stumbling block in getting going? Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's deep. Um, yeah, and I think most of the pastors I talk to, it's not that the work ethic isn't it the issue. Figuring out the right things to do is the issue, and the things that you and I are talking about today. Very rarely is somebody coming and they're knocking on the pastor's door and saying, "You better figure this out, figure out how to get new people in here." It's usually everything but that. And saying yes to something like this and the work that comes along with it means you got to say no to a lot of other stuff, and there's a lot more political ramifications to those things. Yeah, and the best part about it is you're not driving all that as the lead guy. Yeah. Hey, have you heard of a book called The One Thing? So, well, and the authors would probably kill me for telling you this, but the one question is, what's the one thing having been done makes everything else either easier or unnecessary? Which is a great question. When you kind of take a step back from your whole ministry and think, what's the most important thing for me to do next? And if I do that thing, it's going to eliminate a lot of the other work that I have to do. When I ask you that question, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Yeah, I heard a pastor at Catalyst years ago say that when you're doing something when you do things other than what God's called you to do, there's a word for that. Sin, sin. Yeah, and not that I'm saying that doing ministry is sin, but if you're called to quit the saints and you're actually doing ministry, then hey, and if you got a beef with me about that, it's joedobbins at gmail.com. You can just hit me up on that. Hey, let me finish with a kind of a complex question, but I think it needs to be asked. So you were an executive pastor, and now you're a lead pastor. What are three things that every pastor needs to know about his staff, the people that work underneath him? Because you have a unique perspective. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Man, that's huge. That's a whole nother podcast. Just those three things. Hey Joe, man, I hope we can do this again at some point. If you've got something else to say, okay. Yeah, I'll tell you two things about that. If you're the guy that's underneath the pastor, Jim Kuzis said this. I worked for Catalyst for years, so I got all these quotes. But Jim Kuzis said, sooner or later, he said, sooner or later, everybody in your organization leaves. But that's not the quote. The quote was this: that everybody in your organization thinks they know how to do it better than you do. Right? So if you're the person underneath the main person, realize that you feel that way and everybody around you feels that way. But the other side of that is when you're the lead dog, no, you have to understand that nobody underneath you understands what it means to be the lead dog. I learned this now having my own organization and having worked in another organization. As soon as I started my first business and my first ministry, I thought, I cannot believe I complained about these other people not knowing what they're doing, because you really know about 30% of what's going on if you're not the main person. So I absolutely 100% agree with that. Hey, man, I really do appreciate this. And I hope we can, maybe we can have you back and we can do this in the future and dive a little deeper on some stuff. And, but this has been a great interview. And I know that the pastors listening have been served well. So thanks, Joe. Thanks. All right, that's it. Hey, that was awesome, man. You got a severe case of pastor's voice too, dude. You got the I don't I mean it may just be the microphone, but you sound great, man. Oh, yeah. I was going to ask you if you were from there because I have a couple of buddies that are from that area, from St. Louis. Yeah, it's been a crazy couple of years up there for you. Well, and I've been doing like consulting with churches for about 10 or 12 years. And here's my personal experience with that is the pastors that I've known that have gone, that have transitioned out. As a matter of fact, the last church that I built for, the pastor just transitioned out. But here's who you lose. You might lose a couple of people that are writing big checks, but they weren't giving, they were buying something. Right. So you're losing the people that are buying the ability to influence the direction of the church. And then the other people, but the mass of people that you lose are customers who don't spend any money. In business terms, I mean, you lose the people that are kind of dead weight, and they're there because they want to come and be entertained every week, and they call that Christianity, but they're not involved. The people that are giving, serving, and inviting their friends, you couldn't beat them out of there. I mean, like if you started a subscription program and said you got to pay $1,000 a month to come in here, they're going to come. I mean, it's like they're you don't. Those are not the people you lose. And man, the fact that you guys, I mean, this is a testament to you and the previous pastor. The fact that you only had that small of a dip through this is amazing. That yeah, wow, yeah, yeah. Hey, one last question for you. This Mick Fry, we went ahead and let him in because he was so persistent that he had been through this program. And I, yeah, that's crazy. He told me he'd send me bank statements. Oh yeah, that's big. Hey, send me his email address. Yeah, send and just tell. Or I'll tell you what, give him mine and just tell him to contact us, and I'll tell and just mention your name, and I'll tell Jessica to keep an eye out for it. So two things. Go. Yeah, I mean, like if you, I mean, and Jerry does this all the time. I mean, he said, hey, this is somebody that went through, and I took the old site down because it was creating confusion. Yeah, we'll put them in there. So I'd love to do this again with you in a few months and circle back, and I'll ask some more detailed questions because I just didn't know. You're like Jessica was doing. She always does research on people before I get on with them, and she's like, man, he's hard to find information on. And the thing you have to know about Jessica is she has no internet footprint. Like you couldn't find her. Hey, she's worked for me for almost a year. Am I still recording this? Oh, let me turn this off.